Hey there, Michael D'Amico here with Ebike Motor Repair. Today's intention of the video post is to tell you some really common things that we see go wrong with the Brose motors. Some things you can fix, some things you can't fix. As I sort of go through this little list and show it to you, we'll talk about ways that you can remedy it, what things an overhaul can fix or replacement of a part can fix, and some of the things that you can't fix. And also, I'll even talk about how these things manifest as a symptom. So if you're riding and you catch on to any of these behaviors, you can kind of guess. I mean, it's not 100%, you know, it's always an inspection is sort of seeing is believing. That will definitely answer all questions. But it's safe to assume that if your motor is behaving in some of the ways that I'll spell out, most likely you might have one of these problems going on inside. It's time to fix it. All the Brose motors are belt driven, which means technically you have an internal motor that turns a belt, which turns a drive. And belts have seemed to be problematic throughout the legacy of Brose. Apparently they've improved their formula on these belts, but they still have a lifespan. And honestly, I'd like to encourage everybody that rides an e-bike, especially with a Brose that's belt driven, that's a maintenance thing. We change chains on our bicycles all the time, and we don't lose our minds. So let's think about it in the same way. A belt bust, it's definitely a part that needs service, needs repair. How often? Who knows? They have different lifespans. It's totally subjective. Riding conditions, riding style, the type of bike that it's in, all of these things can have an effect on belt life. But let's take a look at how these belts fail and then how they manifest and what sort of symptom you might see when it does occur. Okay, this is the look inside of a belt that has recently busted, and you can see that it has failed catastrophically. I hear this commonly, hey, I think my belt is slipping. Well, here's the thing, your belt's not slipping. Belts either work or they don't. All these little splines and teeth right here kind of shred and strip out, and it sort of delaminates, and just once it's compromised, it just sort of falls apart everywhere, which means that there's no assist at all. So it's kind of an either-or thing. I can't say that there's not going to be some freak circumstance out there where a belt can slip, but it's highly unlikely. So if you're actually experiencing slipping, well, I'll cover that here in a second. I'll show you what the culprit usually is. Let's continue talking about belts. I've often heard customers say, oh, you know what? I found a really cheap Chinese belt online. It specs exactly the same as the Brose belt, and it's only a few bucks. Well, here's the thing. Great, but it's not the same thing. This is a cheap belt, typically found for transmission parts. And sure, it specs the same dimensions, but you can see this thing's pretty floppy. In fact, the customer had about, let's say, I think 4 or 5 minutes on this belt before it started to shred, and it doesn't work anymore. You can see by comparison, the rubber belt versus the fiberglass belt, way more floppy, a lot more give, so this is going to just basically shred almost instantly. This is one of the factory fiberglass belts. And for comparison, I don't know if you can see this on camera or not, if it'll translate, but these are the new carbon fiber belts as compared to the older fiberglass belts. I don't know if you can see, but there's a lot more resistance in the carbon fiber belt. It's just a beefier, a little bit stronger, more sturdy type of belt. So this is a major improvement that Brose did over the past few years on keeping these belt lives, you know, where we would expect or hope that they should be. Okay, so transitioning into this sort of belt slipping symptom, or let's just say a slipping symptom, the culprit usually isn't the belt itself. In fact, this customer called in and said very specifically, hey, I think my belt is starting to slip. Well, if you see, his belt is still fine, still intact. Yes, it's got some wear patterns on there. It's definitely near the end of its life, but this belt is still technically functioning as designed. So his slipping is actually coming from, there is a clutch bearing inside of the drive pulley here, all right? And once you remove the entire drive assembly, you can see that these components come apart. Okay, and then there's usually a crank bearing here. We've already pulled that off for demonstration purposes. But the pulley slides off the torque sensor, and oh, look at that. All these little teeth just falling out. So this one has failed and created a slipping action. So if you're getting intermittent power or slipping, This little guy right here is almost always going to be the culprit. If you ever dig into your motor and do discover indeed that your sprag inside of the pulley has begun to fail like this one has, and you're getting that slipping, it's really a good idea to send this in for service. It does require some special skills and some special tools. Mainly this bearing has to be removed, and it's pretty challenging. That's a pretty narrow little spot behind this bearing to use traditional pullers to pull it off. And also there's a race that's pressed inside of this pulley that is really thin. It's very thin metal, so it can actually break pretty easy. So it does require heat, does require some special bearing press pusher tools to properly remove this without getting yourself into more trouble. So while we've got these two pieces apart, this is a good time to get into some of the other very, very common things we see go wrong and how they manifest with the Brose. So earlier you saw I separated the pulley from the drive assembly, and then this is your torque sensor. And I don't know if you can see this on camera, but these are designed to sort of ratchet clutch. So one spins one way and one spins the other. But the other thing you'll see fail on these are the drive clutch bearings or sprag bearings. Once these T's start to give up, you might hear clicking, you might hear clacking, you might hear cranking. You may get some effects where the drive assembly will continue to rotate a little bit after you stop pedaling. It can manifest several ways, but it's really not the end of the world. This is actually a fairly inexpensive and cheap part to repair or replace. All right, another big issue we see is this needle roller bearing is a very vulnerable point in this motor. If you see, the drive assembly goes through and it rolls on this surface right here. And if enough moisture gets built up in the grease, it just sits there and it can pit the shaft. And once the shaft is pitted, you have to replace the entire shaft. We do have replacements, both new and used, but you don't want to go spending a couple $100 extra on an overhaul when you could just do some simple proactive maintenance and prevent it altogether. But I want to show you this. This little gap goes, essentially, this whole piece goes all the way through the outside of the motor. That might be something you recognize there if you've ever taken your motor out. Crank arm goes here, sprocket goes here. If you look, there is a little gap right here. That lets all the stuff in, all the mud, all the moisture, which is inevitably, if you look in here, just how mucky this is. That's water ingress. All that stuff, it just sort of takes water and grease and froths it all together and really helps accelerate the failure process in these motors. And that little guy right there, the one we sell, we actually sell with a seal. Go figure. A tiny little seal preventing so much problems. This little seal right here fixes all of that. When we do an overhaul or proactive maintenance, we will replace that needle roller, press in this seal before the roller, and then press in the roller after, so that we get a good watertight seal from the outside, which basically solves a huge amount of issues that we see in these motors, which is pretty much moisture, dirt, and water ingress. Okay. All right, so while we're on the shaft assembly here, the whole drive assembly, some other things that can tend to go wrong. In particular, this is your right crank bearing. This is the one that actually will be seen on the outside of the case. It sort of stabilizes the whole drive assembly. This one can tend to get a little bit of exposure to the elements, although it is sealed, but it can still end up, getting a little rough, gritty. So definitely time to change it. In other words, this one, while it is protected, can still fail. Another common failure point is if you think about this whole assembly having multiple points of contact. You've got oriented to the drive side. This would be the right side of your bike. This bearing is exposed to the outside. This bearing is your left crank bearing, which is exposed to the outside of the motor. And then inside you have this middle support bearing, which is similar to the outsides, but it's not technically exposed to the outside. But guess what? Like I mentioned earlier with that unsealed needle roller, guess who's exposed to the outside? This guy. So we'll see this one fail quite a bit, you know, to get real gritty and sloppy. If you look down inside of one of these cases here, you can see the left crank bearing presses into the inside of the case, but it is not sealed. It actually is exposed to the elements. So we'll see this left crank bearing fail quite a bit more often than the right crank bearing will. And even though they've got these little mud flaps on here, I know, you know, manufacturers want to call these seals, but it just pretty much keeps the grease in. It's kind of a cover, a flap, more than it is a proper seal. You got to keep all of the water and dirt out of these units to have them properly sealed. So the way that we have remedied this unsealed left crank bearing is we actually manufacture an X-ring, which is kind of like an O-ring, but if you did a cross-section look at this, it would kind of have an X shape. That's why they call it an X-ring. But we basically put it on the left side, and the neat thing about this is it compresses between the crank arm and the case, and you end up getting a good seal this way. It's not completely invulnerable to getting water past this seal. What I mean is you definitely wouldn't want to pressure wash this or use a strong stream of water because it can blow past it. But for your everyday riding in the woods, getting water on your bike, washing your bike, this does way better job of protecting water from getting in the motor than the way that it was from factory. So another genius thing that Brose did on these motors, this is the motherboard side of the motor on this case cover. There is a gasket here. Sure, that's great. You think, oh, that seals the motherboard side. So if you look behind the motherboard, the gasket touches on this surface, but the hole is way back there. So there's actually a point where the bolt comes through and is kind of in free-floating space before it goes through a hole in the gasket. So it's not actually sealed on these two holes right here on the motherboard panel side. So we remedied that with, we actually manufacture a small steel washer that compresses between the head of the bolt and the outside of the case, making this side good and watertight as well. While we are on the subject of this side of the motor, it's kind of funny. I get a lot of calls about, well, I changed the belt on my motor and it worked fine before, except the belt wasn't working, and then after we put it back in, the motor didn't work anymore. Well, here's the thing. A lot of people don't realize this, but you don't have to take this side off. This is a really common thing. I mean, you do need to take two bolts off from this side that run all the way through over to the other case cover, but these three bolts here, 1, 2, 3, you don't ever need to go in this side. And here is a really good reason why, okay? So I've already pulled this one apart, but if you look right here, this is a sensor plug that goes through one of these ports into the cavity that holds the entire drive assembly and plugs into this pickup sensor or ring sensor. And if you see these little tiny terminals in here, they're pretty small. And guess what? There's free space on either side of them, so it's actually pretty easy to miss them. And that sensor needs to properly be reinstalled by first putting the motherboard on, then installing the ring sensor, then putting the drive assembly in. So which means if you go to do just a simple belt job and you start messing with this side, odds are you have indeed unplugged that sensor internally, and odds are you'll never get it to plug back in perfectly. Then that means you have to remove the entire drive assembly to reinstall this. So you just cost yourself a lot of extra time and energy. And the point is, don't mess with this side. You don't need to mess with this side. In fact, if you ever have successfully removed this side of your motor and plugged it back in and it still works, please comment below. That would be amazing. I do get a lot of frequent calls, people that are trying to change their own belts, and they pull their motor apart and they see this thing wobbling and they think, oh no, my planetary gear has failed. Behind this shield inside the motor, there is a set of planetary gears, just like this. And the way this is constructed is the internal magnets are pressed in from this side And the entire Planetary cluster is pressed in from this side, so there's really no way to service some of these parts without really destroying or causing damage to the internal motor. So it's kind of, once this fails, or if it fails, and there's no guarantee that all of them do or will fail. Some do, some don't. But if it does, it's kind of game over for the motor. But this one's healthy. This one's actually in good condition. So I'll show you some of the ways that these will fail, and even talk about how they sound or how they manifest or what their symptoms are once they do that. The end of this spindle gets supported by the side case cover. And so when these two pieces are married together and it's all fully assembled, it prevents this from wobbling. That little wobble you see in there is perfectly normal. All that's happened in there is the magnets have sort of slapped up against the copper coil. One of the ways you can tell potentially without removing the motor if your planetary gears have failed, the catastrophic failure, you won't be able to roll your bike backwards, or you won't be able to spin the sprocket backwards on the motor. It's just because it's just completely locked up. Now, be careful, because that can also happen with a busted belt. You can get a belt to wad up in there and also create resistance. So again, it's not 100%, but if you hear crunching and grinding and feel seizing when you're trying to roll your bike backwards, it could be the planetary gear has maybe at the end of its life. All right, so here's actually the three main ways that these planetary gear sets will tend to fail. There's several parts in here and several bearings that you actually can't see, but here is one way that you'll see, if you can see on camera, yeah, see the little spindle moving free of this. What's happened is there's a bearing inside of there that is just probably completely fragged, so it allows this to wobble, and that's game over for that one. So this is one way that they can fail, is some of the stuff inside that you can't see, and I say inside, meaning behind that spindle. All right, one of the next ways is, sure, everything seems good here, except, oh no, look at that. The tip of the spindle just literally spun itself right out. So while the cluster itself is still intact, if you look down in between those three gears, the tip of that spindle has just literally just spun itself right off. That's also game over. Actually, on the other side of that bearing right there is the internal motor, and there's just really no way to replace it. And of course, third and my favorite final version of failure is when it just completely grenades. So, let's review. What do we have? Failed planetary gears, belts popping, bearings slipping, bearings going bad, water getting in your motor. Most of these things we can fix. Let's go ahead and rule out when the planetary gear fails, it's basically game over for that motor. I would encourage you to start looking for a new one. Go ahead and get it replaced. Some caution. Sure, there's definitely access to new motors out there that have never been in a bike before, but just beware, the programming parameters won't know what bike it's in necessarily. These motors are pretty intelligent. They know crank arm length, they know gear ratios, they know your wheel circumference, your wheelbase. They know a lot of things about the ecosystem that it's in so that your bike cranks properly. It provides the right amount of intuitive assistance while you're riding. So beware of just going out and getting yourself an eBay replacement motor. We do have them. A lot of our customers will use some of our replacement motors as sort of a backup, so they can send their proper motor in for repair and then at least get riding for a little while, even if it doesn't perform the way you might expect. Definitely consider replacement if your planetary gears have failed. Any of those other items we can definitely fix. Your busted belts, no problem. Belts are something you could probably easily do at home. You definitely need a couple of special tools, in particular a torque wrench that's set to 1/4 Newton meter. It's not a common torque wrench setting that you'll find in most shops, so we do sell that tool online. It's a pretty simple project to do at home. Beyond that, you definitely want to send it in. I'm not saying you're not capable. If you're a do-it-yourself or if you're equipped to do it, sure. We're still here for you for support if you want, but at the end of the day, we've gone through every learning curve you can imagine, so all the mistakes that you could end up having the liability on for yourself, we've already made on trial and error burner motors, essentially motors that are already dead, low risk situation. But we've got all the right tools, all the know-how, all the experience, so if you find yourself beyond a belt, definitely considering sending it in. We just charge parts and we just charge labor to do it. Typically, we're done in between 2 and 5 business days. Sure, there's circumstances that are longer, and actually there are circumstances that are faster, but that's the average for now. The rest of what we've discussed here, if you ever have anything that doesn't really fit within what I showed you, definitely give us a call, shoot us an email, leave a comment, whatever you like. Yeah, give us the mysteries. We're always on search for mysteries. And I will tell you too, if there's other questions that you guys would like to see us answer, odds are we've encountered it. So please, please, please leave your questions, comments below, and we could certainly try to build some content around things that you might be interested in hearing from us. Thanks for tuning in.